My parents kicked me out of the family for crying after a breakup. When I begged them not to do it in front of my little brother, my mom smiled and said, "He needs to learn that weakness gets you erased." I spent the next hour memorizing their faces. That was 9 months ago. Last night, my sister called from a locked room, whispering, "She's bringing the syringe." You are not going to believe what my family put us through. For years, I lived in a nightmare disguised as a mansion, where every 3 years, we held this terrifying ceremony to vote someone out of the family forever. And I mean forever. That night, they left with nothing but the clothes on their back. My mom came from old money, and she ran our family like some twisted corporation, always needing downsizing to stay profitable. She inherited this tradition from her father, who apparently kicked 2 of his own kids out for not hitting their quarterly expectations. And my dad? He's a behavioral psychologist. He saw this whole vote as natural selection in action, and get this, he kept detailed files on everyone, tracking our contributions versus our emotional drain on resources. They called it the assessment. It felt like a board meeting where human beings were just numbers on a spreadsheet. I remember watching them vote out my Aunt Sarah when I was 10. Why? Because she got divorced. My mom actually said, "Failed marriages are contagious, and we can't risk the infection spreading." Aunt Sarah begged to stay for her daughter, my cousin Rachel, but my parents were stone cold. They gave her 2 hours to pack while Rachel screamed and cried, and my dad, he just took notes on Rachel's emotional response for his research. The voting was supposed to be democratic, but my parents controlled the entire narrative. They'd present evidence of each person's failures throughout the year. Scorecards, hidden in their bedroom, tracking every single mistake, every moment of weakness. Even us little kids had to participate and cast votes. My own assessment wasn't due for another year. I was only 16. But then, an emergency family meeting was called. What triggered it? I'd helped my little sister, Emma, through a panic attack about her grades. Seriously. My mom stood at the head of our dining table, leather portfolio in hand, while my dad set up his camera to document everything. "We're calling an emergency assessment," she announced, her voice chillingly calm. "Claire has been poisoning this family with her weakness, and it's time to cut our losses before she infects her younger siblings." They'd been building a case against me for months. Things like showing emotion when my boyfriend dumped me, or hugging my brother, Lucas, after he had nightmares. My mom even presented photos from hidden cameras, showing me crying in my room as evidence of emotional instability. My dad, with his charts, proved my displays of weakness had apparently increased my siblings' stress hormones by 30%, based on saliva samples he'd been secretly collecting. The whole presentation went on for 2 hours, detailing every single flaw and failure I'd had since childhood. My 14-year-old sister, Emma, tried to defend me, but my mom shut her down, saying, "Emotional attachments cloud judgment, which is exactly why Claire needs to go." It was agonizing to watch my little brother, Lucas, his face so small and confused, as they made him read a prepared statement. He stumbled over the words, saying my hugs made him soft and my help with homework prevented him from developing independence. They'd rehearsed this with him for weeks while I was at school. By the time they called for the vote, I knew exactly how it would go. It was 4-2. Only Emma and Rachel voted to keep me. My mom smiled like she'd just closed a billion-dollar deal. She handed me a garbage bag for my belongings. "You have 1 hour to pack, and then you never existed," she said, while my dad, ever the clinical observer, reminded everyone that contacting me would trigger their own emergency assessment. I wasn't allowed to take photos or anything that proved I'd ever been part of the family. Emma tried to slip me her necklace, but Mom caught her, adding it to Emma's file as evidence of weak emotional regulation. They'd already changed the locks and installed new security codes while I was at school that morning. My dad gave me this clinical goodbye speech about how exile would strengthen everyone's psychological development. My siblings were forced to watch from the staircase, cameras capturing their reactions. I spent that hour just trying to memorize their faces, every detail, while my mom supervised my packing to make sure I didn't take anything valuable. She'd already canceled my phone plan and frozen the bank account they'd set up for me as a child. Expelled members forfeited all family resources. Lucas broke away from my dad and ran to hug me, which, of course, earned him a month of isolation therapy to break his attachment. As the security guards my parents had hired escorted me out, Emma screamed from her window that she'd find me when she turned 18. My dad was still filming, barely looking up from his camera. My mom's last words to me were, "Don't worry, they'll forget you existed within 6 months, according to the data." 3 months later, at 2 a.m., I got a frantic call from an unknown number. It was Rachel, whispering that Emma had just been voted out in another emergency assessment for keeping my photo hidden in her backpack. But Emma had discovered something while packing. My dad's files showed they'd been planning to vote me out since I was 12, and every assessment since then had been rigged to slowly isolate me from potential allies. The real horror? The section labeled Post-Exile Protocol. It detailed what happened to family members who didn't accept their banishment quietly. There were newspaper clippings about former family members who died in accidents or disappeared completely. Emma had stolen the whole file, but Mom caught her at the door. Emma was hiding in the pool house. Rachel's voice cracked as she told me Mom was coming with Dad's medical kit because some exiled members needed help staying gone. Emma's last words before the line went dead were, "She's bringing the syringe." I hung up. My heart was pounding. I ran to my old house. It was 12:42 a.m. I crouched in the darkness outside, a memory flashing, finding Aunt Sarah's name crossed out in red ink in Mom's planner when I was 12, with Q3 restructuring written next to it. A loud crash came from the pool house. I saw Emma had pushed furniture against the door. My dad walked up with his locksmith tools, and my mom. She was preparing something in a small glass bottle, the porch light glinting off a syringe in her hand. My hands shook as I dialed 911 again. I whispered that someone was breaking into a house in Greenwich's richest neighborhood, knowing the cops would come fast for that address, even though I didn't mention it was my parents I was reporting. My dad started working on the lock. My mom stood behind him, her voice low and chilling, talking about the sedative taking 3 minutes to work, and how they'd need to catch Emma when she fell. It made me realize they'd done this before, to other family members. Emma's voice came through the door, yelling that she'd sent Dad's files to Mr. Patterson at school, to the newspaper, and even uploaded them online. Mom and Dad exchanged a look. This wasn't part of their plan. I crawled closer, using the big bushes as cover, the same ones where Emma and I used to play when we were little. The cloying smell of jasmine flowers made everything feel even worse. My dad spoke in his calm doctor voice, saying the upload could be traced and deleted. They had 7 minutes before the cops showed up, 12 before anything spread online, so they should keep going with their plan. Like Emma's life was just some computer problem to fix. Blue and red lights started flashing down the street. Mom saw them. She told Dad they needed to stop, to take the medical kit inside, but he just kept working on the lock like he didn't hear her. The lock clicked open. Emma screamed as Dad pushed against the furniture blocking the door. Without thinking, I grabbed a garden rake from the shed and ran at them, yelling for them to get away from her. My dad turned, looking surprised, but not shocked to see me. He said I was trespassing on private property and this was a family matter, while Mom already had her phone out, probably calling their lawyer. Emma's voice came through the door again. I have recordings of Dad talking about Aunt Sarah and cousin Michael and others. Hearing Michael's name made my stomach drop. I hadn't heard it in 5 years, not since he disappeared after getting voted out. The sirens got louder. My mom quickly shoved something into her pocket, telling Dad the police would find concerned parents checking on their troubled teenager and a runaway who broke in. 2 cop cars pulled into our driveway, lights flashing. I recognized Officer Smith from school assemblies where Dad had helped train him on teenage psychology stuff. Mom walked toward them, hands visible, and started talking before they could even ask questions, explaining Emma's mental health crisis and my behavioral issues. Officer Smith looked between us while his younger partner kept his hand near his weapon. Emma yelled from inside, "I won't come out until you check Dad's computer for a folder called Post-Exile Protocol." The younger officer suggested everyone calm down, and Dad immediately agreed, putting on his reasonable professor voice about Emma being stressed about her SATs. I watched Mom's hand drift toward her pocket where she'd hidden whatever it was, probably that syringe, while her other hand typed fast on her phone, likely alerting their lawyer or whoever helped them with their sick protocol. Suddenly, papers started sliding out from under the pool house door. Emma was shoving printed emails and documents onto the patio, where the officer's flashlights caught words like removal timeline, sedation dosages, and accident staging. Dad moved to grab the papers, but the younger officer told him to step back. That's when Mom's calm finally cracked. These were private family documents taken out of context by a disturbed teenager, she snapped. Officer Brown got on his radio, calling for a supervisor, while more papers kept sliding out, showing bank transfers and medical prescriptions that were never filled, and newspaper clippings about former family members who had died. The pile of evidence kept growing. I could see Officer Smith's face changing as he read the headers. His training from Dad probably didn't prepare him for this. The way Emma shoved papers under the door with the cops right there made me wonder if she'd been planning this escape for a while. How long had she been secretly collecting Dad's files? The back door opened. Lucas stood there in his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing his eyes, looking around at all the police cars. He looked so small and confused, and my chest hurt seeing him try to understand what was happening to our family. Mom started toward him, but Officer Brown stepped between them. Lucas kept asking why the police were here, what was wrong. A black SUV pulled up, and a woman in a police uniform with more stripes on her sleeve got out. Officer Smith went to brief her. Sergeant Williams walked around, taking in the whole scene, scattered papers all over the patio, Emma still locked in the pool house, me standing as far from my parents as I could get. She picked up some of the papers, and her face got serious as she read headers about medication schedules and accident reports. The pool house door finally cracked open. Emma stood in the doorway, holding Dad's laptop against her chest, arms wrapped around it. Her whole body was shaking, but she stayed in the door frame like it was protecting her from our parents, who were both staring at her. She said everything was on the laptop, including the vote recordings, planning documents, and what really happened to Aunt Sarah. Mom stepped forward, saying Emma had stolen private property from Robert's office, but Sergeant Williams raised her hand to stop her. The sergeant said, "Given what I'm seeing, we need to examine everything." Mom's face went white. More officers arrived and started collecting all the papers while one set up a table to organize the evidence. At 1:15 a.m., they moved everything to the dining room table and started going through it page by page while my parents sat on opposite ends of the couch. My dad tried using his psychologist voice, saying both girls had histories of emotional problems, and this was clearly manipulation. But his clinical tone sounded weak now, with police reading his own files about drugging family members. My phone buzzed. It was Rachel, calling from the highway, saying she and Aunt Sarah were driving down from Boston, where they'd been hiding. She said they had medical records from when Mom tried to have Aunt Sarah institutionalized after she questioned the family votes. Sergeant Williams was looking at something on the laptop that made her face change completely. She waved Officer Davis over and told him to call the detective from Major Crimes about the Morrison case that was flagged 3 years ago. Mom's hands started shaking. Dad went completely still as the sergeant kept reading whatever was on the screen. A white Tesla pulled into the driveway. A man in a tuxedo got out, still wearing a bow tie from whatever party he'd left. Mom's lawyer. He walked straight to my parents and told them to stop talking immediately, but it was already too late. Emma had been uploading everything to social media and tagging local news stations while hiding in the pool house. Lucas started crying, grabbing onto Dad's leg, asking why everyone was being mean to them. Dad just patted his head absently. Even now, with everything falling apart, Lucas was just another data point for Dad to observe and document. I sat down on the patio steps, feeling all the adrenaline drain out of my body as exhaustion hit me hard. Emma came over, still clutching a flash drive, and sat next to me on the cold concrete. She whispered that she'd made copies of everything and hidden them in different places, just like our parents taught us to be thorough. The sound of car doors slamming made everyone turn toward the driveway where a dark sedan had just pulled up behind the police cars. A woman in her late 30s stepped out, wearing a plain blazer and jeans, with tired eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She walked straight toward my parents and pulled out a badge that caught the porch light. Detective Vasquez introduced herself and said she'd been watching certain financial patterns since Aunt Sarah filed a complaint 3 years ago about her sister's family. Mom's face went white as her lawyer stepped forward from the shadows and told the detective his clients wouldn't answer any questions without formal charges being filed. The detective stayed calm and explained they were investigating potential false imprisonment and conspiracy charges, which meant the house was now a potential crime scene. Dad's hand shook slightly as he adjusted his glasses, and Mom took a step back toward the house like she was calculating escape routes. Another set of headlights swept across the lawn at exactly 2:10 a.m. I recognized Aunt Sarah's old Honda before she even parked. She looked so much thinner than 3 years ago, with dark circles under her eyes. But when she got out of the car, her whole body radiated determination. Mom actually stepped backward when she saw her sister walking up the driveway. And it was the first real emotion I'd seen from her all night. Rachel jumped out of the passenger side and ran straight to Emma and me where we formed a tight huddle on the porch steps. She whispered fast about how they had been documenting everything for months, including every accident and disappearance connected to 12 different families. The detective was taking notes while Mom's lawyer kept objecting to everything. But Dad suddenly spoke, without his usual clinical filter. He said, "We didn't understand the burden of maintaining excellence, and that weak links destroy entire systems, and they were just protecting the family's future." His professional mask had completely fallen off, and his voice cracked on the word future, like something inside him was breaking. More headlights appeared on our street, and within minutes, 3 news vans pulled up with their satellite dishes already extending into the night sky. Emma grabbed my arm and showed me her phone. The social media posts she'd made were spreading faster than we could track. Mom watched the news crews setting up their cameras, and I could see her carefully built image starting to crack as reporters began asking neighbors what they knew about our family. Lucas pulled on my sleeve and asked in a small voice if he could stay with me instead of going with Mom and Dad. That simple question made something flash across Mom's face that looked almost like hurt before her corporate mask snapped back into place. She started to reach for him, but stopped when the detective announced they were seizing all electronics and documents in the house as evidence. Teams of officers began carrying out boxes of Dad's research files and Mom's financial records, while photographers documented everything. The whole empire of control they'd built was being cataloged and tagged as evidence, piece by piece, right in front of them. Emma showed me her phone again. The uploaded files had been shared over 300 times already, with comments pouring in from other families recognizing the same patterns. People were sharing their own stories about relatives who disappeared or died in accidents after being cast out of wealthy families. Mom's lawyer pulled her and Dad aside and advised them to leave immediately before more charges were filed. But Detective Vasquez stopped them at their car. She told them they needed to be available for questioning within 48 hours and couldn't leave the state while the investigation was ongoing. The hunters, who'd controlled everything for so long, were suddenly the ones being hunted and watched and restricted. 20 minutes later, a white van with a state seal pulled into our driveway, and a social worker stepped out, carrying a clipboard and a stuffed bear. She walked past Mom and Dad without looking at them and knelt down next to Lucas, who was sitting on the porch steps. Her voice was soft but firm when she explained that he couldn't stay here while his parents were being investigated. I stepped forward and told her I was his sister and asked if he could stay with me instead of going into the system. She looked at my ID and made some calls while Lucas grabbed my hand so tight it hurt. My dad stood by the door, watching the social worker with that same look he got when observing test subjects in his studies. Even with his whole world falling apart, he was taking mental notes about crisis intervention protocols and childhood trauma responses. His fingers twitched like he wanted to write it all down for later analysis. Aunt Sarah walked over to Detective Vasquez and pulled a thick folder from her bag. She showed the detective medical records from 3 different doctors, all confirming permanent nerve damage in her left arm from whatever they'd injected her with years ago. The specialists would testify about the specific sedative used and how it wasn't meant for human use without proper medical supervision. Mom tried one more time to take control of the situation. She stood up straight and used her boardroom voice to tell everyone this was all a misunderstanding. She claimed she had documentation proving Emma and I were mentally unstable and making up stories for attention, but her voice cracked on the word documentation and her hands shook as she reached for her briefcase. Nobody was buying it anymore. Emma was still going through Dad's laptop when she gasped and turned the screen toward me. She'd found psychological profiles Dad had created for every family member, rating our termination risk on a scale from 1 to 10. My profile started when I was 8 years old, and by 12, I was already rated 9.5. The note said I showed excessive empathy and emotional attachment that threatened family efficiency. Lucas was only a 3 because Dad thought he could still be molded into their image with enough conditioning. Around 4 in the morning, they loaded us into police cars to take us to the station for formal statements. The fluorescent lights in the interview room made everything feel unreal as I sat across from a detective and described 15 years of assessments. How did Emma know to make copies and hide them in different places before all this happened? That's such smart thinking for someone so young. The way she uploaded everything while hiding shows she really understood how important timing was for keeping everyone safe. I told her about the voting process, the hidden cameras, and the files Dad kept on everyone. I explained how family members disappeared after being voted out and how we were never allowed to ask questions. She typed everything into her computer while a video camera recorded my statement for evidence. Lucas fell asleep on my shoulder in the waiting room while we waited for the others to finish their statements. His breathing was steady, but he kept twitching in his sleep like he was having bad dreams. I hoped Dad's conditioning hadn't gone too deep and that Lucas could still learn what real family was supposed to be like. At 5:30 in the morning, Rachel handed the detective a handwritten list of names she'd memorized over the years. Every family member who'd been voted out in the past 15 years was on that list, with the dates they'd left. The detective took the list to her computer and started cross-referencing the names with missing persons reports and death records. She came back 40 minutes later with a stack of printouts, and her face was pale. 3 of the names matched suspicious deaths in the tri-state area. 2 had died from overdoses despite having no history of drug use, and 1 died in a single car accident on a clear day. All 3 deaths happened within 6 months of being exiled from the family. The room went cold as we all realized what that meant for the family members we'd never heard from again. Emma started shaking and then broke down completely as it hit her how close she'd come to being another statistic. I held her while she sobbed into my shoulder, and we both thought about that syringe Mom had been carrying to the pool house. If we'd been even an hour later, Emma might have ended up like those 3 names on the detective's list. The next morning at 6:15, I stood at the station window, watching people walk past on their way to normal jobs with normal families who didn't vote each other into oblivion. The sun was just coming up and painting everything the soft orange color that made the whole world look peaceful. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and watched a mom drop her kid off at the bus stop with a hug. She ruffled his hair before he got on, and I had to look away because that simple gesture felt like something from another planet. Emma was curled up on the bench behind me with her head in Rachel's lap, while Lucas slept across 3 chairs pushed together. Rachel sat next to them, scrolling through her phone and showing Emma the messages pouring in from kids at school who'd heard what happened. The station was mostly empty except for us and a few officers doing paperwork. Around 7 o'clock, an FBI agent walked in, wearing a dark suit and carrying a thick folder. The detective came over, and they talked in low voices for a few minutes before approaching us. The agent explained that Mom's money transfers to silence former family members had crossed state lines, which made this federal now. She'd been moving funds through shell companies in Delaware and Nevada to pay off people who might talk about what really happened to exiled family members. The scope of everything kept getting bigger, and we were only scratching the surface. Lucas woke up, confused and scared, and started asking for Mom, which broke my heart. Aunt Sarah sat with him and held his hand while she explained in simple terms why we couldn't go home right now. She was so patient with his questions and kept rubbing his back when he started to cry. She had this soft way of talking that Mom never used, and Lucas actually calmed down instead of getting more upset. The detective's phone rang, and she stepped away to answer it. When she came back, her face was grim. She said Mom and Dad had just arrived with a whole team of lawyers. At 8 o'clock sharp, they walked into the station like they owned the place. Mom wore her power suit, and Dad had his briefcase full of documents. Behind them came 3 lawyers in expensive suits, carrying more briefcases and tablets. They demanded to see their children immediately and threatened to sue everyone in the building. The FBI agent didn't even blink at their threats. She calmly explained that the children were in protective custody, pending investigation of multiple federal crimes, including conspiracy and wire fraud. Mom's face went from confident to furious in about 2 seconds. Dad started quoting legal precedents, but the agent cut him off and said their credentials meant nothing here. One of the lawyers tried to argue jurisdiction, but the agent pulled out a warrant and laid it on the table. The warrant listed 17 different federal violations they were investigating. Mom's hands shook slightly as she read it, and I saw real fear in her eyes for the first time ever. Meanwhile, Rachel's phone was blowing up with notifications. She showed me her screen. #FamilyAssessment was trending nationally on social media. Someone had leaked parts of Dad's research files, and people were sharing their own stories about toxic families. Hundreds of comments poured in from people who'd been through similar situations with controlling parents who treated love like currency. The story had gone viral overnight, and news vans were already gathering outside the station. By 10 o'clock, CPS had arranged emergency foster care for us. The social worker was this older woman who'd seen everything and didn't seem fazed by our situation. She'd found a place that could take all 3 of us together, which was apparently really rare. The house was nothing fancy, but when we walked in, it smelled like fresh bread, and the foster mom hugged each of us without hesitation. The living room had mismatched furniture and crayon marks on the coffee table from other kids who'd stayed there. Our room had 3 beds with handmade quilts and a bookshelf full of young adult novels. It felt more like home than our mansion ever had. Emma was unpacking her bag when she found one of Dad's tiny cameras hidden in the lining. Her face went white as she realized what it meant. She showed it to me, and we started checking everything we'd brought from home. We found 3 more cameras in our clothes and bags. Dad had been recording us constantly for his research. Every private moment in our bedrooms, every breakdown, every vulnerable conversation had been documented and analyzed. The violation felt endless, and Emma threw up in the bathroom when it really hit her. The foster mom helped us search everything and put all the cameras in a bag for the detective. She didn't ask questions, just made us tea and let Emma cry on her shoulder. The next afternoon, the detective called with an update that made my stomach drop. They'd found evidence of a second property Mom owned, about 2 hours away. The paper trail showed she'd been making payments on it for 15 years, but it wasn't listed in any of their official financial documents. Local police were getting a warrant to search it, and the detectives said they suspected this was where some of those difficult transitions Mom mentioned had been handled. Lucas was coloring at the kitchen table when he looked up and asked if Mom and Dad were bad people. The question hung in the air, and I didn't know how to answer it. How do you explain to an 11-year-old that his parents are brilliant and successful, but completely missing the part of them that should love their children? I told him they were complicated, and that sometimes smart people do really wrong things. He went back to coloring, but I could see him thinking about it. That evening, Aunt Sarah called to tell us she'd filed a civil suit against my parents. She was suing for emotional distress and attempted murder on behalf of Emma. Other exiled family members had already contacted her lawyer, wanting to join the class action. 3 cousins we'd never even heard of had come forward with their own stories about being voted out years ago. The lawyer said more people kept calling as the news spread. That night, Emma couldn't stop getting up to check the locks on our foster home's doors and windows. She'd pull back the curtains and stare into the darkness for minutes before going back to bed. I found her at 3 o'clock in the morning, testing the deadbolt for the 5th time. Her hands were shaking, and she kept looking over her shoulder like Mom might appear behind us. The foster parents found us both sleeping on the floor by the front door when they woke up. They didn't say anything but moved a couch into the hallway so we'd at least have somewhere soft to sleep while we watched the door. The detective called that afternoon with news about the second property search at Mom's summer house. The FBI team had found an entire room in the basement filled with medical equipment, including 4 stands and restraints bolted to metal tables. There were shelves of syringes and bottles of sedatives that Dad must have stolen from the hospital where he consulted. The worst part was the filing cabinets full of records going back 50 years, to Mom's grandfather's time. Each folder had a photo and detailed notes about family members who'd been voted out, including dates they'd supposedly died in accidents. Some files had newspaper clippings about car crashes, drownings, and house fires. The federal agents counted 37 folders of exiled family members spanning 3 generations. Mom's system wasn't something she'd invented, but something she'd inherited and perfected. The next morning, we got word that federal authorities had started freezing all of Mom's accounts, including the trust funds and offshore holdings. Her family's fortune, built over decades of cruelty, was being systematically locked down by court order. The prosecutor said they'd found evidence of bribes to local officials and payments to people who'd helped make exiled family members disappear. Every bank account and investment was being traced and seized as evidence of conspiracy. Mom's lawyers were scrambling to protect assets, but the government was moving faster. It's hard to wrap my head around Lucas asking if his parents were bad people. It makes me wonder how confusing this must be for him when everything he thought was normal is suddenly wrong. That afternoon, a social worker brought us news that Dad had requested to see Lucas for what he called psychological support during his incarceration. The request was immediately denied, but Lucas started crying when he heard about it. He kept saying Dad was still his father, even after everything. The social worker held him while he sobbed about missing the father who treated him like a lab rat. It broke my heart watching my little brother struggle with loving someone who'd never really loved him back. The detective called that evening with shocking news about a breakthrough in the case. A former family member everyone thought had died 5 years ago had contacted her from witness protection. This person had escaped Mom's protocol and been hiding with federal help ever since. They had recordings and documents that would destroy any defense Mom and Dad tried to mount. Their testimony would prove the conspiracy went back generations and involved multiple murders. Detectives said this witness was the key to making sure my parents never hurt anyone again. 2 days later, Emma and I sat in a conference room with 3 prosecutors, preparing us for what would come next. They warned us the defense would attack our credibility and paint us as disturbed teenagers seeking revenge. They'd claim we were making things up for attention, or that we'd misunderstood family discipline. The lead prosecutor showed us the questions we'd likely face, including accusations that we were mentally unstable. Emma gripped my hand under the table while they explained how brutal cross-examination could be. They said Mom's lawyers would try to break us on the stand and make the jury doubt everything we said. That night, our foster family made us dinner, and for once, it felt almost normal. They cooked spaghetti with garlic bread and a simple salad, and we all sat around their dining table. There were no scorecards or assessments or cameras recording our behavior. Lucas actually laughed when their dog stole a meatball off his plate. The foster mom just smiled and gave him another one without keeping track of the loss. Nobody analyzed our eating habits or took notes on our conversation. We were just kids having dinner with people who actually wanted us there. 3 days later, Mom's lawyer contacted the prosecutor with an offer. She was willing to provide information about other wealthy families practicing similar assessments in exchange for reduced charges. Even facing life in prison, she was still trying to negotiate like this was a business deal. The prosecutor said she'd identified 12 other families across the country who'd been exiling members for generations. Mom had records of their methods and could provide evidence of their crimes. She wanted to trade their freedom for a lighter sentence, claiming she was just following family tradition. The FBI director himself got involved when they discovered something incredible about Mom's father. He was still alive, in a private psychiatric facility in Vermont, where he'd been declared mentally incompetent 15 years ago. The records showed he'd tried to expose the family tradition to authorities, and Mom had him committed. He'd been drugged and isolated for over a decade to keep him silent about what the family had been doing. Agents were racing to the facility to interview him before Mom's lawyers could interfere. The detective picked me up the next morning to visit our old house and identify evidence for the investigation. Walking through that front door felt like entering a tomb full of poisonous memories. My childhood bedroom looked exactly the same, with my stuffed animals on the shelf and homework on the desk. But now I could see the tiny cameras hidden in the air vents and smoke detectors. The detective showed me the recording equipment in the basement that captured every moment of our lives. There were hundreds of hard drives labeled with our names and dates going back years. Dad had been studying us like we were animals in his private laboratory. Every birthday and holiday and quiet moment had been recorded and analyzed and judged. The prosecutor met with us 3 days later in a small conference room at the courthouse and spread out financial documents across the table. She pointed to wire transfers and grant applications showing Dad's research had been getting funded by something called the Institute for Family Optimization, based in Switzerland. They'd been paying him $200,000 a year to document our family's assessment, process, and track what happened to the people who got voted out. The prosecutor said this went way beyond our family and that similar experiments were happening in 12 other states, with wealthy families using the same voting system. Lucas started seeing a therapist who specialized in helping kids who'd grown up in cults. And during his second session, he drew our whole family. He made Mom and Dad look like robots with wires and metal parts, while Emma and Rachel and I were the only ones who looked human. The therapist showed me the drawing and said Lucas understood more than we thought about what had been wrong with our family all along. Emma was going through the flash drive we'd found when she gasped and turned the screen toward me. She discovered a folder labeled Emergency Protocols that made her hands shake so bad she dropped the laptop. Inside were detailed plans for what to do if anyone ever exposed the family tradition, including lists of lawyers to call and private security firms that specialized in making problems disappear. The worst part was a document called Risk Assessment that had all our names with percentages next to them, showing how likely we were to cause trouble. My name had 98% next to it, with a note that said, "Primary threat requires immediate containment if exposure occurs." For days later, we sat in family court while the judge reviewed all the evidence and granted Aunt Sarah temporary guardianship of all 3 of us. She said it was unusual to place 3 children with someone who wasn't their parent, but keeping siblings together after this kind of trauma was more important than following standard protocol. That same afternoon, Mom and Dad were arrested at our old house on charges of conspiracy and child endangerment and attempted murder. The news cameras caught them being led out in handcuffs, and they looked so much smaller than I remembered, like all their power had come from us being afraid of them. Mom tried to keep her head high, but Dad just stared at the ground while the detective read them their rights. 2 days later, Lucas woke up screaming from a nightmare about being voted out and having to leave with nothing. I held him in the dark while he cried and told him over and over that no one would ever vote him out of anything again. His whole body shook, and he kept asking if I was sure they couldn't come back and make us have another assessment. I promised him they were gone, and that showing emotion wasn't weakness, and that loving each other was actually the strongest thing we could do. The prosecutor called the next morning to tell us the trial date had been set for 6 months out. She warned us it would be brutal because our parents had money and connections, and their lawyers would try to make us look like ungrateful children making up stories. But she said we had truth and evidence and each other, which was more powerful than all their money combined. Emma couldn't handle regular school after everything, so she started taking classes online from Aunt Sarah's dining room table. She was brilliant at science, just like Mom, but she wanted to use it differently, to help people instead of studying them like lab rats. She'd already decided she wanted to be a doctor who helped kids who'd been through trauma, and she studied harder than ever, with a real purpose now. Then 4 days later, the detective called with news that made my stomach drop. Dad had made bail after his lawyer argued he wasn't a flight risk, and the judge agreed to house arrest with ankle monitoring. We were all terrified he'd find some way around it, because he always found ways around rules he didn't like. The detective promised they were watching him closely, but I couldn't sleep that night, thinking about him out there planning something. At 3 o'clock in the morning, our foster home security alarm started screaming, and red lights flashed through the hallway. Police found Dad's research assistant crouched outside Emma's window with recording equipment and a notebook full of observations about our adjustment patterns. He tried to claim he was just gathering data for an academic paper, but the cops arrested him for stalking and violation of a restraining order we didn't even know existed. The detective told us Dad had put a restraining order on himself months ago as part of his bail conditions, but never told anyone because he planned to violate it all along. Within 2 hours, they had Dad back in custody, and this time, the judge wasn't buying any of his research excuses. The courtroom was packed when they brought him in, wearing orange and handcuffs, while his lawyer tried to explain why sending his assistant to spy on us was somehow part of academic freedom. The judge cut him off and revoked bail completely, saying Dad was a persistent threat who couldn't stop treating his children like lab rats, even facing prison time. 2 days later, a law firm called, saying Mom's extended family wanted to meet with us about setting up an education trust from the frozen assets. We sat in their conference room while lawyers explained how Mom's cousins and aunts had no idea about the voting tradition and were horrified when they read the court documents. They wanted to make sure we had college funds and therapy covered, since they felt guilty for not knowing what was happening in our family all those years. One of Mom's cousins started crying when she saw Lucas, because he looked just like Mom at that age, before everything went wrong. That night, Lucas sat at Aunt Sarah's kitchen table drawing with his new markers and showed us his picture of our new family standing in front of a regular house with a white fence. He'd drawn me, and Emma, and Aunt Sarah, and Rachel, all holding hands with big smiles, and no robots or charts or assessment folders anywhere in the picture. The prosecutor called the next morning to tell us that with Dad's bail violation and all the new evidence from his files, both parents were looking at 15 to 20 years minimum. She said the family tradition would die with their imprisonment, and no judge would ever let them near children again after what they'd done. A month later, we all sat in a real therapist's office with comfortable chairs and no cameras, while she helped us understand that excellence didn't require cruelty and love wasn't supposed to have conditions. Lucas kept asking if it was really okay to make mistakes, and the therapist had to explain over and over that normal families didn't vote people out for being human. Emma got her acceptance letter to an art program she'd secretly applied to and cried holding it because Mom had always said creativity was an unproductive waste. She'd hidden her drawings for years in a box under her bed, afraid they'd be evidence against her in an assessment. But now she could finally paint without fear. We drove to see our grandfather at the care facility where he'd been living since his breakdown 20 years ago when he tried to stop Mom's father from continuing the tradition. He was thin and shaky, but his eyes were clear when he saw us walk in, and he started crying when he realized we'd escaped what he couldn't prevent. He whispered that he tried to warn people, but no one believed him about what the family was doing behind closed doors. He held Lucas's hand and kept saying sorry over and over while Emma showed him her art school letter, and he smiled for the first time anyone could remember. 6 weeks later, we had Sunday dinner at Aunt Sarah's house, and it was messy and loud, and nobody kept score of anything. Lucas spilled juice on the tablecloth, and instead of marking it down in a file, Aunt Sarah just laughed and helped him clean it up. Emma burned the rolls, and I forgot to make the salad, and Rachel's mashed potatoes were lumpy, but we ate everything anyway, because this was what real family looked like. Nobody mentioned contributions or quarterly reviews or emotional drainage calculations while we passed dishes and told stories about school. The prosecutor sent forms for our victim impact statements that were due next week for the sentencing hearing. I sat at my laptop, trying to find words for losing my childhood to spreadsheets and fear, but finding real family in the ruins of the one that threw me away. I wrote about learning that love doesn't require perfection, and families aren't supposed to be corporations where people get downsized for having feelings. That night, after Lucas brushed his teeth, he came to my room and asked if he could call me Mom, since I took care of him now and made sure he was safe. I pulled him close and told him I was his sister, and that was enough, because we didn't need hierarchy or assessments or titles to prove we loved each other. Emma heard us talking and came to join our hug, and we sat there together in my tiny room at Aunt Sarah's house, finally understanding what home really meant. For the first time since that emergency assessment where they voted me out with a garbage bag and 2 hours to pack, we were truly safe and truly family, without any conditions or scores or votes that could take it away.